There are some insults that arrive loudly, sharp words, raised voices, clear disrespect that leaves no doubt about where you stand. And then there are the quieter ones, the kind that come wrapped in politeness, delivered with a smile, printed on expensive paper, and placed gently in front of you as if what they are offering is not control, but care. The night my in-laws handed me a document called a family image plan, they thought they were helping their son protect his future. What they were really doing was showing me exactly how little they understood about worth. Because while they were trying to redesign my life into something more acceptable, they had no idea that the future of their biggest public project was already sitting inside a trust my father controlled. And unlike them, he had no interest in making a scene. He just wanted Thomas Whitmore to meet him where power didn't look like a ballroom. But before we get to that, you need to understand how something that looked so polished on the surface was already cracking underneath. My name is Hannah Reed. I'm 35 years old, and I'm a trauma surgeon, which means I spend most of my life in rooms where nobody cares what you look like, as long as your hands don't shake when someone is bleeding out in front of you. I don't wear elegant dresses to work. I wear scrubs that smell faintly of antiseptic no matter how many times you wash them. My hair is usually pulled back too tight or not tight enough. My shoes are practical. My hours are brutal. And the only thing that matters is whether the person on that table is still alive when I'm done. There is no room in that world for performance. Only decisions. Fast ones, precisiones. Sometimes the difference between a life continuing and a family being told it didn't. That kind of work changes you. It strips away anything unnecessary. It teaches you that dignity has nothing to do with presentation and everything to do with responsibility. Which is probably why I never felt the need to explain myself to anyone, not even the man I married. I met Evan Whitmore in a place that had absolutely no business changing either of our lives. Adiner. The kind with cracked leather booths and coffee that tastes like it's been thinking about retirement for too long. It was late. I had just come off a 17-hour shift. My hands still smelled like latex and disinfectant. I remember sitting there, staring at a plate of food I was too tired to eat, trying to decide whether I had enough energy left to drive home. Evan was in the booth behind me, on the phone, calm voice, measured, the kind of tone people use when they're used to managing problems without letting anyone hear the strain. When he hung up, he leaned slightly forward and said, "You look like you had a worse day than I did." I didn't turn around right away. I just said, "Depends. Were you trying to save lives? Or just bill for them?" There was a pause. Then he laughed. Not politely, not strategically. Just genuinely. That was the moment I noticed him. He didn't introduce himself with a title. Didn't mention his firm. Didn't name drop. He asked what I did. I told him. He didn't try to impress me. He asked questions. Real ones. The kind that come from curiosity, not performance. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was talking to someone who wasn't trying to measure me. He said later that being around me felt like exhaling. I believed him. Back then, he probably believed it too. For a while, our worlds stayed separate. I didn't ask much about his. He didn't ask much about mine beyond what I chose to share. We met in the middle, in small places, quiet dinners, walks, late-night conversations that didn't need to prove anything to anyone. It wasn't until months later that I learned what his last name actually meant. Whitmore. If you worked in law, finance, or development, you knew it. Whitmore Infrastructure Group, the kind of company that doesn't need attention, because it already exists in the backbone of cities. Roads, contracts, steel, projects that reshape entire districts, quiet power, the kind that doesn't announce itself, because it doesn't have to. When I found out, I didn't panic. I didn't suddenly start performing. I just paid attention. Because money doesn't tell you who someone is, but it does reveal what they've been taught to value. At first, nothing really changed. Evan was still the same man. He showed up. He listened. He brought takeout to my apartment and sat on the floor because I only had one decent chair. He once told me he liked my place because it felt real. I asked him what that meant. He said, "Nobody here is trying to impress anybody." I remember that line, because later, I would wonder whether he admired that. or just treated it like something temporary, something he could visit. Before returning to the world he actually belonged to, we got married quietly. No spectacle, no performance, just a ceremony that felt honest. For a while, it worked. Then the language started changing. Not all at once. Never all at once. That's not how this kind of thing happens. It comes in small adjustments, suggestions, context. My parents are a little traditional. They just see things differently. Try not to take it personally. They care about appearances. Appearances. That word started showing up more often. Then came the pauses. The moments where he would look at me like he was trying to figure out how I would be perceived by people I hadn't even met yet. I didn't like that. But I ignored it longer than I should have. Because when something is good, you don't want to be the one who starts questioning it. I didn't meet his parents right away. They were busy, traveling, managing things. There was always a reason. Until one night, there wasn't. The invitation came. Dinner at their home. Formal. Simply. Overdue. I remember standing in my apartment before leaving, staring at my reflection. Not because I didn't know what to wear, but because for the first time, I realized I was about to be evaluated. Not as a person, but as a fit. I chose something simple, clean, not trying too hard, not pretending to be something I wasn't. Because if I had to perform to be accepted, then acceptance wasn't worth much to begin with. Their house was exactly what you would expect. Large, controlled, every detail intentional, nothing out of place. The kind of space that doesn't just exist, it announces a standard. Evan's mother, Celeste Whitmore, greeted me with a smile that was technically warm, but felt measured. His father, Thomas Whitmore, shook my hand like he was assessing something, not rudely, just analytically. Dinner started well enough. Polite conversation. Questions about work, about schedule, about how demanding my job was. But there was something underneath it. A pattern. Every question wasn't just curiosity. It was calibration. How many hours do you work in a week? Do you see yourself continuing that long term? Is it sustainable with a family? Do you find it limiting in other areas of life? Limiting, I answered calmly. Honestly, because I had nothing to hide, but I could feel it. They weren't trying to understand my life. They were trying to measure how much of it would need to change. Evan tried to soften things, redirect conversations. But each time, he pulled back too quickly, and I noticed that. I noticed retreat. Main course ended. Dessert came. And then, Celeste placed a folder beside my plate, carefully, gently, like she was offering something valuable. I hope you'll look at this with an open mind, she said. I didn't open it right away. I looked at Evan. He didn't meet my eyes. That was when I knew this wasn't spontaneous. Inside the folder was a document titled Family Image and Transition Plan. Structured, organized, thought through, sections, bullet points, recommendations. Not emotional, not messy. Worse, polished, professional, controlled. It outlined how my life could be adjusted to better align with the Whitmore family's public image, my career, my schedule, my presence, even my appearance. Suggestions to transition out of trauma surgery into a leadership role within their family foundation. Healthcare initiative. Strategic, appropriate, visible, manageable. There were notes about public-facing events, about presentation coaching, about media readiness, about hosting. It wasn't written like an attack. It was written like a solution, and that's what made it dangerous, because they didn't see it as disrespect. They saw it as improvement. I read the entire thing, every page, slowly, carefully, because if I was going to respond, I needed to understand exactly what they believed they were doing. When I finished, I closed the folder, gently, and for a moment, no one spoke. Thomas leaned back slightly. We're trying to make things easier before problems develop, he said. Celeste added, this isn't criticism, it's guidance. Guidance. I almost smiled, because there it was. The quiet arrogance of people who believe their way of living is the default version of success. I looked at them, then at Evan. then back at them. And I asked the only question that mattered. Did either of you consider that I might not want to be redesigned? Celeste's expression shifted slightly. Thomas answered instead. You're taking this more personally than necessary. Of course, because when someone tries to reshape your life, the problem is never what they did, it's how you reacted. I nodded slowly. Then I said, you don't want a daughter-in-law. I let the silence sit for a second. You want a version of one. And that landed. Not loudly, but deeply. I stood up, not in anger, not dramatically. Just done. I save lives in rooms where nobody cares how I look. I said, if that doesn't fit your image, then maybe your image is the problem. I turned to Evan. He looked like he wanted to say something, but he didn't. And that hurt more than anything his parents had said, because I could handle judgment. What I couldn't ignore was silence. I nodded once, then I left. No raised voices, no scene. Just the sound of a chair moving back and a decision being made. I drove to my father's place that night, because some things you don't process alone. He opened the door before I knocked twice, looked at me once, stepped aside. No questions. Not yet. That's how he's always been. He lets you arrive before he asks you to explain. I sat down, told him everything, from the dinner, to the document, to the silence. He listened, completely still. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he asked one question. Did they think you were the problem, or that you needed to be improved? I thought about it, then said, they thought I could be optimized. He nodded, like that confirmed something. Good, he said. I blinked. Good? Yes. He leaned back slightly. Better that than a cheap insult. I frowned. That didn't feel better. No, he said calmly. But it's clearer. I didn't answer. He looked at me. They didn't reject you, he said. They tried to control you. And somehow, that felt worse. He stood up, walked to an old cabinet, opened it, pulled out a folder I had seen before, but never asked about. He placed it on the table, not dramatically, just deliberately. Your husband's family is preparing to announce something big this week, he said. A project. I nodded. I had heard Evan mention it. Gala, press, major investment. A defining move for the company. My father tapped the folder lightly. They're very proud of it. I looked at him, then at the folder, then back at him. And that's when I realized this conversation wasn't over. It was just beginning. My father didn't open the folder right away. He just rested his hand on it, like he was deciding how much of the truth I actually needed. They've been planning this for years, he said. The Whitmores don't build small things. They build statements. I nodded. That sounded exactly like them. Waterfront redevelopment, he continued. Mixed use, medical wing, private residences, transit access. The kind of project that lets a family say they didn't just make money, they shaped a city. I had heard pieces of it from Evan. The way he talked about it, you could tell it mattered. Not just financially, symbolically, legacy. My father finally opened the folder. Inside were documents, maps, contracts, layers of ownership structures that would make no sense to anyone who hadn't spent years navigating them. He turned one page toward me. Do you see this section here? I leaned in. Parcel lines. Access corridors. Utility easements. This, he said, tapping lightly, is the only viable access route that connects the project to the existing infrastructure grid. I followed the lines, then looked up, and he met my eyes, and it doesn't belong to them. There was no drama in his voice, no satisfaction, just fact. I sat back slowly. Who does it belong to? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he closed the folder, took a sip of coffee, then said, a trust. I waited. And who controls the trust? I asked. He held my gaze. I do. The room felt quieter, not heavier, just clearer. For a second, I thought about the dinner, about Celeste's voice, about the word guidance, about the way they had already decided what version of me would be acceptable. And suddenly, everything shifted. Not in a vengeful way, not in a now I win way. Just in a way that revealed how incomplete their understanding had been. They don't know, I said. No, my father replied. They don't. And you haven't told them? No. Why not? He shrugged slightly. Because they never asked the right questions. That sounded exactly like him. Silence settled between us. Then I asked, "What are you going to do?" He looked at me. Not at the folder. Not at the maps. At me. What do you want me to do? I thought about that carefully. Because this wasn't just leverage. This was a line. I don't want a spectacle, I said. He nodded. Good. I don't want them humiliated in front of a room full of people. Another nod. And I don't want you to fix this for me. That made him pause. Then, slowly, he smiled. Not wide. Not proud. Just approving. So you want them to understand, he said. Yes. And your husband? That question sat heavier than the others. I didn't answer right away. Finally, I said, I want him to decide who he is, without being forced. My father studied me for a moment, then closed the folder again. All right, he said. Then we won't make a scene. He stood up, picked up his jacket. But we will make something very clear. The gala was exactly what you would expect from a family like the Whitmores. Elegant, precise, designed to impress without looking like it was trying too hard. Large glass panels overlooking the water. Soft lighting, perfectly spaced conversations. People who knew exactly how to stand, how to speak, how to belong in that kind of room. Investors, city officials, philanthropists, media, all gathered to witness something important. Or at least, something that would be presented as important. I wasn't there, not because I wasn't invited, but because I chose not to be. Some rooms, you don't need to enter to understand. Evan was. Of course he was. Standing in a tailored suit that fit him perfectly, looking exactly like the version of himself his parents had always expected him to become. But if you had watched him closely, you would have seen it. The tension, the hesitation, the slight delay before he smiled. Because something had shifted, and he knew it, even if he didn't fully understand how yet. Thomas Whitmore stood near the center of the room, confident, composed, ready. This was his environment, his stage, the kind of moment that reinforces everything a man like him believes about control, preparation, and inevitability. Because to him, this project wasn't just happening. It was already decided, or at least, it had been, until about 15 minutes before the main presentation. That's when one of his senior advisors approached him, quietly, not urgently, because in rooms like that, urgency is never displayed. But something in the man's posture was off. Thomas turned slightly, listened, and then, for the first time, that evening, his expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough. Confusion, then calculation, then something closer to concern. He asked a question. Short, direct. The advisor answered. Even shorter. Thomas went still. Because what he had just been told didn't make sense. Not at first. The access corridor, the one they had already accounted for, the one that connected everything, the one that made the entire project viable, it wasn't secured. Not fully. Not legally. Not in the way that mattered. Because the final authority, the one signature that actually locked it in, belonged to a trust that had never formally transferred control, a trust that had never been challenged, because no one had thought to question it. And now, that trust wasn't responding. Thomas asked who was handling it. The answer came quickly, then slower, then more carefully, and when the name finally surfaced, it landed. Samuel Reed. For a second, nothing happened. Because recognition doesn't always come instantly. But when it does, it's unmistakable. Thomas looked across the room, found Evan, and in that moment, everything connected. Not the money, not the surface. Something deeper. Something he had missed. Something he had dismissed. He turned back to the advisor. Get him on the phone. The advisor nodded. Stepped away. Minutes passed. The room continued as if nothing had changed. Because no one else knew. Not yet. The music, the conversations, The quiet confidence of people who believed they were part of something stable. Thomas's phone vibrated. He looked down, then answered. Mr. Reed. There was a pause. Then he listened, for longer than anyone expected. His jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, in restraint, when he spoke again. His voice was controlled. Where are you? Another pause. Then a response. Short. Simple. Thomas's eyes shifted. Not toward the stage. Not toward the crowd. Toward the exit. He ended the call. Turned to his advisor. I'll be back. No explanation. No announcement. Just a decision. And then, he left his own event. The diner hadn't changed. Same cracked booths. Same dim lighting. Same coffee that tasted like it had been brewed hours ago and left to wait. My father sat in the corner, exactly where he always did. Not trying to hide. Not trying to stand out. Just present. Thomas Whitmore walked in 10 minutes later, still in his tailored suit, still carrying the presence of a man used to being in control, but something about him was different now. Less certain. More aware. He spotted my father immediately. Walked over. Didn't sit right away. Mr. Reed. My father nodded once. Thomas. No handshake. No performance. Just acknowledgement. Thomas sat. Looked around briefly. Then back at him. I assume this isn't a coincidence. My father took a sip of coffee. No, he said. It isn't. Silence. Then, Thomas leaned forward slightly. The corridor access? He said. You control it. My father didn't rush to answer. He set the cup down, folded his hands, and said, I protect it. That distinction mattered. Thomas understood that. I need it released, Thomas said. Direct. To the point. The way men like him speak when they believe clarity is strength. My father nodded slowly. I'm aware. Another pause. Then Thomas added, We've already invested significant resources into this project. I know. It's going to benefit the city. Yes. It creates jobs. Yes. Thomas stopped, because he could hear it. The pattern. Every argument he made was being acknowledged, but not accepted. My father leaned back slightly, then said, You've built something impressive. Thomas didn't respond, because he wasn't sure if that was praise or setup. But somewhere along the way, my father continued, you started believing that building things gave you the right to define people. That landed, quietly, but precisely. Thomas's expression hardened slightly. This isn't about my family, he said. My father tilted his head. No? Silence. Because it was. They both knew it. My father continued. You tried to redesign my daughter. No anger. No accusation. Just truth. Thomas exhaled slowly. That was intentional, my father said calmly. Thomas stopped, because denial would have been pointless. It was an attempt to help her integrate, Thomas said carefully. My father almost smiled. Into what? Thomas didn't answer, because the answer wouldn't sound as clean out loud as it did in his head. My father leaned forward slightly. My daughter works in rooms where people die if she hesitates, he said. And you thought the problem was how she presents herself at dinner. That was the first moment Thomas looked. Uncomfortable. Not defensive. Not angry. Just aware. I may have misjudged, Thomas said. Yes, my father replied. You did. Silence settled again. Then Thomas straightened slightly. We can discuss this, he said. Find a solution. My father nodded. We are. Thomas hesitated. Then asked, what do you want? And that was the moment everything shifted. Because for the first time, Thomas wasn't stating terms. He was asking for them. My father didn't answer immediately. He looked at him, studied him, then said, I want you to understand the difference. He paused, between control and respect. Thomas held his gaze. And? My father's voice stayed calm. I want you to stop treating my daughter like something that needs to be adjusted. A beat. I want you to acknowledge her life as it is, without trying to improve it. Another beat. And I want you to make that clear, without packaging it as generosity. Thomas listened, really listened, because this wasn't a negotiation about money. It was about position, about perspective, about something he couldn't buy his way around. "And if I agree?" Thomas asked. My father picked up his coffee again, then said, "Then your project moves forward. Simple, clean, no theatrics, no threats, just reality." Thomas sat back, processing, because this was not how he was used to operating. No leverage he could outmaneuver, no angle he could exploit, just a boundary he had to accept. Finally, he nodded, slowly, understood. My father inclined his head slightly, then added, "One more thing." Thomas looked at him. "This doesn't fix your son." That landed harder than everything else, because it was true. The room went quiet again, and in that silence, for the first time that night, Thomas Whitmore understood that control had never really been his. When Thomas Whitmore walked out of that diner, he didn't look like a man who had just lost something. He looked like a man who had just understood something. And sometimes, that's a far more dangerous shift, because losing can be recovered. Understanding changes how you move forever. The next morning, the gala continued in headlines, photos, articles, carefully written summaries about vision, growth, impact. Nothing about the interruption, nothing about the missing signature, nothing about the man who had quietly left his own event, because the Whitmores didn't deal in public cracks. They managed perception, and perception remained intact. But inside the structure, things had already changed. The project moved forward. Of course it did, because my father kept his word. He released what needed to be released, signed what needed to be signed. Not as a favor, not as a concession, but as a boundary acknowledged. The difference mattered, and Thomas knew it. I didn't hear from Evan that night, or the next morning, which didn't surprise me, because some realizations take time, especially when they require you to see yourself clearly for the first time. He showed up 2 days later, at my apartment, not with flowers, not with a speech prepared, just there, standing at the door like he wasn't entirely sure he had the right to knock. I opened it. We looked at each other for a moment, and in that moment, I could see it. Not guilt. Not exactly. Something quieter. Something heavier. Recognition. "I know," he said before I could speak. I didn't ask what he meant, because I already knew. He stepped inside slowly, like the space felt different to him now. And maybe it did, because it was the first place he had ever been himself, before everything else started shaping him again. "I should have said something," he continued. Not defensive, not explaining, just stating. "Yes," I said. That word sat between us. Not harsh, not soft, just true. He nodded. "I knew it was wrong," he said. "The moment she put that folder on the table, I knew." I watched him carefully. "And you still didn't say anything." He didn't look away. "No." Silence. Then he exhaled slowly. "I told myself I was trying to keep things from escalating," he said, "that I could handle it later, that it didn't need to become a conflict in that moment." He paused, then shook his head slightly. "That wasn't true." I didn't interrupt, because this mattered. "I wasn't protecting the situation," he said quietly. "I was protecting myself." That was the first real thing he had said since he walked in. "I didn't want to stand against them," he continued. "Not in front of you. Not in front of them." Another pause. "And I told myself that made me reasonable." He looked at me then. "It made me a coward." There it was. No softening, no reframing, just the word. And something about the way he said it made it land, because he wasn't asking me to disagree. He was finally describing himself honestly. "I can handle being judged," I said. "What I can't handle is standing next to someone who stays silent when it matters." He nodded. "I know." Another silence. Not empty. Just necessary. Then he reached into his jacket, not quickly, not dramatically, and placed something on the table. A document. I didn't touch it right away. "What is it?" I asked. "My resignation." I looked at him. "From the firm?" He nodded. "Effective immediately." That surprised me, not because I didn't think he could do it, but because I didn't expect him to do it that fast. "Why?" I asked. He didn't hesitate. "Because I finally understood what that silence cost," he said. He leaned forward slightly. I've spent years telling myself I was independent, that I had my own path, that I wasn't just part of their structure. A small, almost bitter smile. But when it mattered, I acted exactly like I'd been trained to. He sat back. And I don't want to be that person. I studied him, carefully. Because words are easy. Change isn't. What are you going to do instead? I asked. He exhaled. Start over. That wasn't enough. He knew it. I've been talking to a few people, he added, quietly. For a while now. That caught my attention. About what? He hesitated for just a second, then said, opening a small practice. I didn't react. He continued. Workers, labor cases, injury claims, the kind of people who don't have the resources to fight companies like the one I just walked away from. That landed differently, not as a gesture, as a direction. They get ignored, he said, or buried in paperwork, or pushed into settlements that don't actually protect them. His voice stayed steady. I've spent years watching that happen from the other side. A beat. I don't want to be on that side anymore. I didn't respond immediately, because this wasn't about whether the idea sounded good. It was about whether he understood what it would cost. You know that's not temporary, I said. I know. That's not a transition. I know. That's a different life. He nodded. I know. Silence again. Then I asked the only question that mattered. Are you doing this? Because of what happened at dinner? He shook his head slowly. No. Then, after a pause, I'm doing this because of what happened inside me at that table. That was the right answer. Because if it had just been about me, it wouldn't last. But this was about him. And that meant something. We didn't fix everything that day. That's not how real things work. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no immediate forgiveness. Because trust doesn't come back all at once. It comes back, in pieces, in consistency, in decisions repeated when no one is watching. But something shifted, not between us, inside him, and that was where it needed to happen. A week later, I received a letter, handwritten, from Celeste. I didn't expect that. Not from her. I opened it slowly, carefully. The words were measured, but not controlled. And that difference mattered. She didn't apologize in a polished way. She didn't justify. She didn't reframe. She wrote, I believed I was protecting a standard. What I was actually doing was revealing one. I read that line twice, then continued. I saw your life as something admirable, but incompatible. I didn't realize that what I was really seeing was something I didn't understand. Another pause. I mistook your independence for inflexibility, your work for imbalance, your presence for something that needed refinement. Then, finally, I was wrong. Simple, direct, not perfect, but real. And sometimes, real is enough to begin with. Thomas didn't write. That also didn't surprise me. Men like him don't process things on paper. They process them in action. I heard from my father a few days later. Short conversation. Casual, but not really. He followed through, my father said. On what? On understanding. I waited. He made it clear, my father continued, to everyone who needed to hear it, that your life is not a liability to their image. That was significant, not because it changed anything for me, but because it showed something had shifted for him. And the project? I asked. It's moving, my father said. But differently. I raised an eyebrow. How? He took a sip of coffee on his end of the line. They're making adjustments, he said. Less about display, more about function. I smiled slightly. That must be uncomfortable. It is, he said. But it's necessary. Months passed, quietly, not dramatically, but steadily. Evan opened his practice. Small office. Nothing impressive. No glass walls. No skyline views, just a desk, a few chairs, and a growing stack of files from people who had nowhere else to go. Workers injured on sites, people pushed out without compensation, cases that weren't worth enough money for big firms to care about, but meant everything to the people living them. He worked long hours, different from before, but just as demanding. And when he came home at night, He didn't talk about status, or clients, or wins. He talked about people, about cases that mattered, about things that felt real. I watched him, not closely, not critically, just consistently, because trust doesn't rebuild through words. It rebuilds through patterns. And slowly, those patterns changed. One evening, I finished a long shift, walked out of the hospital as the sun was setting, my body exhausted, my mind still running through decisions from hours earlier, and for a moment, I just stood there, breathing, letting the noise settle. Evan was sitting on the curb outside, in a wrinkled shirt, tie loosened, looking like someone who had been working all day without noticing the time. He looked up when he saw me, stood, walked over, didn't say anything right away, just took the bag from my shoulder. Like it wasn't a gesture, just something he did now. We walked to the car together, quiet, comfortable, real. As we got in, he glanced at me. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded. "Tired." He smiled slightly. "Good day?" I thought about it, then said, "Hard day." He nodded, like he understood the difference. Because now, he did. Later that night, we sat on the small balcony of my apartment. No big view, no skyline, just city noise in the distance, and a quiet that felt earned. "I used to think power looked like control," he said. I didn't respond. I thought it meant being able to shape outcomes, manage situations, keep things from breaking. A pause. "Now I think it's something else." I looked at him. "What?" He leaned back slightly. "I think it's knowing when not to." That was new and true. I saw my father a few days later. At the diner, same table, same coffee, same quiet presence. He looked at me once, nodded. "You look steady," he said. "I am." He took a sip. "Good." I sat across from him and won. For a moment, we didn't talk, because we didn't need to. Finally, I asked, "Did you ever think this would happen?" He smiled faintly. "I thought something would happen," he said. "I just didn't know what you would choose." "I didn't choose any of it," I said. He looked at me. "No," he said, "but you chose how to stand in it." That stayed with me. If you ask people how this story ends, they'll probably look for something simple. A victory, a loss, a clear resolution. But that's not how it works. There was no moment where everything clicked back into place. No scene where everything was suddenly perfect. What there was clarity. My in-laws didn't stop being who they were. They just started seeing something they hadn't before. My husband didn't become a different person overnight. He just stopped pretending to be one he wasn't. And me, I didn't change at all. I just stopped tolerating things that didn't deserve my patience. The night they handed me that document, they thought they were measuring my value. What they were really measuring was their ability to recognize it. And they failed. At first, but failure isn't always the end of a story. Sometimes, it's the moment everything finally becomes honest. Because in the end, this was never about money, or status, or image. It was about something much simpler. The difference between people who need the world to adjust around them and people who stand exactly where they are and let the world decide what that means. And if there's one thing I learned from all of it, it's this. Real power doesn't walk into the ballroom. It doesn't need to. It waits, quietly, until the ballroom comes looking for it. And by the time it does, everything that mattered has already been decided.